Greetings everyone, my name is Dr. Jason Freeman. I'd like to welcome you all to my channel. In this video, I have an engaging and wide-ranging conversation with two of my brothers from across the pond, Dr. Edson Burton and Mr. Rob Mitchell. We talk about why it's so important to incorporate Black history in the UK curriculum. We also talk about the challenges of incorporating that history. For example, not ignoring slavery, but not focusing so much on it that we ignore other aspects of Black history, and not being so celebratory that we ignore the reality of what life was like for Black people in UK historically. So without further ado, let's begin. All right, so greetings. So today we have two brilliant scholars with us, Mr. Rob Mitchell, Dr. Edson Burton. So they help teach this, co-teach the course with me, the Blacks in Britain course in Bristol. And I want to just kind of do a quick little story about how I met them. And so back in January of 2022, I had my students in Bristol. They were doing a tour. The tour was fine. It felt though it was missing something. It was a little bit impersonal, a little bit kind of disconnected. And so I got a message from Cam Ip, who's coordinating the course on the ground in England. And she said this was a great educational opportunity for the students. So I went in and I looked at the time. I was like, it'll be great, but I want the students to be able to experience Bristol a little bit. So I was basically told Cam, thank you, but no thank you. But I didn't want to kind of leave the people hanging. So I said, let me just talk to them first face to face and let them know why. And so the person I talked to was Mr. Rob Mitchell. And so after just a couple minutes of talking to him, it was pretty clear that's what the course was missing. And so I figured, there has to be a way that I can have him meet the students. And so we arranged to have him come and meet the students at the end of the day because they were already in the city. And then of course he contacted Mr. Edson Burton, and it was a great experience. And so my first question to you guys, again, first, thanks for being here, is so one thing I noticed was your passion for education, passion for educating. So think about your own background. What does that passion come from?
Rob, do you want to go first?
Well, I'm not usually called a scholar, so back to your introduction, so I would question that slightly. But having said that, when you put it that way, I think, okay, maybe I am, because actually my job title in general terms, I do a lot of freelance work. I work for a charity, which is an education charity, but my job title is kind of creative media producer and educator. So actually, I think I've always been drawn to, I see Edson's dropped out, I've always been drawn to education as a key part of what the offer is. I mean, I was a co-founder of a company with Sean Sobers and co-director with Louise Linus, called Firstborn, and a major part of our work was in education. And while I don't think I could be a full-time teacher, I was in a school today, but I do that kind of thing where you go in as an intervention, you come out again, and I come out saying, thank you, teachers, for doing the job you do, because it's a very difficult job. But the idea of going in, provoking questions, trying to identify with a student, and engaging in non-traditional forms, like most of the work we did were always after school, in summer schools, community settings, where you don't have the strictures that you really must impose on children if you were in a school setting. So that's kind of always been my drive or my passion to some degree, and creative challenge. So from schools, primary schools through to adult education, I think the idea of sharing knowledge, stimulating questions and ideas, being provocative, I've always enjoyed that from my point of view. But yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call myself a scholar, whereas Dr. Burton, that's supposed to be his cue, mind.
Yeah, the dramatic moment of the cue. No, I guess to the heart of the question, I think for me, like many, I'm 54, so second generation African Caribbean, West Indian parents from the islands of Jamaica and Nevis. So growing up in the British education system, there's really quite fine differences between being a child of the 60s, 70s and a child of the 80s. So I did grow up with a multicultural education. However, there wasn't much in the sense of within that multiculturalism, there's quite a focus on the more, I think at that time, what would have been seen as the more recognizable cultural differences of people from the Asian, Indian subcontinent. Whereas we grew up being told that we spoke broken English. Um, Roots was our only sort of blueprint for, and then the odd program by Alan Missouri, which is probably way too old for your students to remember. So in many ways, I developed a sense of a more positive Black consciousness, um, implicitly either through my parents, but mostly really through Rastafarianism, um, as what we would call, I guess, our negritude moment. Um, and not that everyone who was conscientized by Rastafarianism were Rastas or went into the whole of what that religious and ideological journey meant. But nonetheless, it kind of raised the bar. So for me, then, I arrived at university probably with a more positive sense than many of my Black peers, who I think it's fair to say, I think had internalized a lot of the anti-Blackness, unsurprisingly, with which we were brought up with. A kind of really problematic relationship with Blackness with our parents, who were, I guess, were colonial subjects, brought up in all the indoctrination of colonial administrations, and they hadn't actually grown up in post nation building Jamaica and Nevis, but also growing up in a society in which certainly the political establishment screamed very loudly that you were problematic, even though, on a day-to-day basis, we were kind of working things out. So I think for me, the passion for education partly comes from being from a certain background and realizing the absence, realizing some of the journeys, some of the discoveries that have been radical for me in terms of rethinking Black history, Black resilience, and trying and wanting to share that. Because while I think there has been great strides, I still think that there is still such a kind of a disconnection between academic thinking, the wealth of research, but also how that research gets renewed. And I think popular knowledge and thought, and in some ways the internet does and doesn't help with that. There's availability of knowledge, but sometimes that knowledge is more available is passe or problematic. And there isn't a steer, there isn't a friend to say, actually, this has moved on, or this was problematic then, is problematic now.
That actually brings me to
I think that's been
oh,
interesting. No, go on. Sorry, go to your next question.
so it's kind of a building on kind of what you both just said. So kind of two double, kind of a double question. So I'll talk about my own experience. So I would say that my knowledge of kind of Black history, whether it be American or British, I learned almost in spite of my formal education. So I did have a professor in college who introduced me to things like the diaspora and kind of the kind of more global view of kind of the Black community, and also just the history of Africa as well. But most of what I've learned, I've had to kind of go off on my own. And so that's kind of a double question. So one is, would you say that your formal education kind of was an obstacle to kind of learning about, say, Black British history or Black history as a whole? And if so, kind of where would you have to go? Where did you go to kind of maybe learn about things like, history, like Edward Colston and some of his problematic history and things like that?
Yeah, go, Edson.
Well, okay. We need a cue.
Okay, sorry.
It's gonna go first. It's gonna go first. Yeah, so just for the record, I grew up in a town 50 miles north of London, and I came to Bristol at 94. So the challenges that I had
In 94.
in 1994.
Yeah.
So I was less aware of Bristol's race relations problems. But in many ways, they were kind of sort of shared across the country. This was a country of amnesia. I would say that up until A level, where Black art was featured, it was more, my encounter was through Black art, in particular through poetry. So Mahmoud Jamal, and Linton Kwesi Johnson. But also Linton Kwesi Johnson, partly at school, but mostly really through reggae records. There was a song called Sonny's Letter, which was a dub plate record set to music. And that was quite revolutionary for me because we grew up in, again, the resources just weren't there. So it wasn't until I did my first degree that I strongly encountered African American literature. And I was a history student for my A levels, but our key text was really just about the scramble of Africa by Europeans. The Africans were absent. It was all about who cut this border and who made this border and who traveled up here. So my postgraduate education was like a revolution, but it in a sense, it sort of gave a rigor and a spine to some of the more positive experiences that I'd had through activists and through the music, especially in reggae.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, reggae and hip hop you could add. Thinking Run DMC and Public Enemy and these guys, Gangstar is actually probably, depending on when you're growing up, quite useful as well for adding to the narrative. Formal education. I was educated in Barbados for a while. I was actually born in the city next to Edson, but I didn't actually stay. I stayed there for 11 months, shipped off to Barbados, came back to England, came to Bristol after that. So it turns out that I was born in that. Were you born there as well, Edson, Bedford? Were you born in Bedford?
Yeah, I was born in Bedford.
Were you born in Bedford?
Yeah, I was born in
All
Bedford.
right, so
we
were
in Bedford
born
Hospital.
about 10 miles apart, about a year apart, because he's old as 54. I'm a baby at 53. So that's we're quite close. But actually, I lived in Barbados for formative years up to about 8, and very English and education there.
Okay.
A lot of focus on the 3 R's. That's reading, writing, and arithmetic for anyone who's not from that generation with that expression. And of course, the history is completely English. Barbados is so known as Little England, prides itself on speaking better English than the English. Nowadays, it's completely different, of course, but this is the Barbados I grew up with up until about 1978. And as a colony, of course, it was only British English, whereas a lot of as far as recent European colonization is concerned, so like where my mum's from, Dominica, that switch between the French and the English. Jamaica had that Spanish influence, so as far as European colonial powers are concerned, it was only the English. So we were very English. Little England, it was named as Barbados. But that's a good foundation for general education coming back to England. I didn't have a new language to learn or anything like that. So I didn't have to be put in a remedial class because I didn't speak English or anything like that. And, obviously a bit of ahead of the game as far as those foundationals are concerned. So there was a passion for education as well in itself. So learning. College, I think more of a Marxist influenced education there, studying drama and theatre. But I think the kind of, there's something, I remember at the time when I was going through college, a lot of my black friends who I grew up with, who I was drawn to socially, I say a lot of them, a few of my key ones anyway, were very drawn to the Nation of Islam. And hearing the discourses, I could completely hear what the education they were getting. And as one of my friends, Mark, used to say, it made them do the 360 to actually look around. And I thought that was a brilliant education. I've always admired them for that. But I couldn't get to the white people are devils kind of thing. I couldn't accept that as an absolute. So while I appreciate what Nation of Islam are doing, I couldn't necessarily embrace it fully for myself. And also kind of white Marxist educations who were helping me to do the 360. That it wasn't like all white people are like this. It's like we have a kind of a dominant way of thinking, and that needs disrupting sometimes for whatever reason. That needs disrupting sometimes. So that was my college education.
Mm.
In university, I still didn't come black. I think I remember my dissertation was a good opportunity. My final year dissertation was a good opportunity to do something. I thought I don't even want to be typically doing something black. There was a complete lack of black theatre and that kind of thing. There was not a complete lack. There was a person whose name I can't remember used to come in and do African theatre so once in a while. And no doubt at degree level I could have picked it up and gone with it. You know, I'm not complaining about that. This is England, you know, so British theatre, European theatre, Greek theatre, that's what it is. I'm not bothered.
Mhm.
But I chose for my dissertation to look at because I studied theatre, film, and television, and I studied for my dissertation to look at the development of the European media program. So this is well before Brexit. This was the measures to improve the development of industries of audiovisual production. You know, Europeans love the acronyms, media program. So I literally went at European film development. That's why I was interested in, you know. But it wasn't until afterwards when I was living in a lovely Crescent up the hill, and I wanted to do a little film around with my friend Annabelle. We wanted to do a little film about the Crescent because it was a lovely, beautiful Georgian Crescent, and we kind of had the communal area at the back, and there was something really wonderful about it. And we were part of the research. We went up because the garden was owned. It turned out by the merchant venturers. So that was my introduction to the merchant venturers, and I kind of went. We went up there, and they were open to us. They weren't hiding anything to kind of research a little bit about that crescent. And I can't even say that I can specifically was identifying the merchant ventures for what they were. I can't say there was any specific. At the same time, there was an intense feeling of, gee, I think I need to do something more around my own history. I just felt there was something missing there. And in fact, since that point, that's all I've done. So I went down the hill, from up the hill in Clifton, literally up the hill, down the hill to the ghetto in a nice way, to St. Paul's, etc., to Kumba. In fact, Edson was working there. But I mean, Kumba, in fact, a lot of the education, to summarize, would have come through community entities. So I wasn't around for the John Lynch, well, it was a bit John Lynch African Education Project or other I know Leith Morrison did a Black History course, and various people have done Black History courses, but they've all been usually college, usually some sort of elective or community. And I think probably largely where we picked up this education was self-taught, electives and extra optional activity, and community and creative kind of research for creative purposes, usually to make something or to find out something. That's been my experience.
Okay. Would you say that today, because I know Rob, you mentioned like kind of what you've been working with schools. Would you say that's changed a bit in recent years, or is it pretty much the same as when you were kind of younger?
I mean, it's changed a bit. Awareness is out there, but it's very risky, you see, because you got to be careful who teaches this stuff. It's very sensitive. But I say this stuff depends what this stuff is.
Yeah.
Even though, for example, and I think transatlantic slavery was also on the curriculum when I was a kid, when I was growing up in the 80s or whatever in England. But one has to be very careful how this stuff is taught. Not just this stuff, but you do see that just having something on the curriculum doesn't mean that it's going to be taught well, sensitively, sensibly, and 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 reduce the damage that was supposed to. It was supposed to be there for. It's double-edged sword. So yes, I think a lot has changed. I don't know if a lot has changed as far as, I mean, certainly since 2020. 2020 has been another turning point. So I mean, people are more aware of what literature, for example, goes on to the curriculum in schools. Of Mice and Men is still there, and I think it should be. I don't think they should change that for some reason. But of course, it had the N-word plasters all over it. How do you treat that? Every teacher teaches that very, very differently. I mean, there is a general literary question as why the hell is it there? But not for me, not for those reasons. I would say take with it. You've got to say, why should we care about American literature of that time? You know, that's just a genuine question. Do you know what I mean?
No, absolutely.
9 times out of 10, it's because the teachers themselves have studied it, and it's just easy. The books are in the cupboard. They don't have to rebuy any new books. They don't have to prepare notes again. So it's kind of easy. You can go from one year to the next. But what I do like about it is the fact that it's one of those texts which goes across generations. There's not a lot of things that goes across generations, but think there's definitely more awareness of diverse literature, of which the tools of English, critical analysis can be, well, it's not really critical analysis at
Yeah.
school.
Well, I'd say that in my experience, there's been two kind of almost contradictory forces happening with education. There's been a growth of awareness, and that has meant that as either creative or as an academic, I've been asked to come into schools, but it's normally during either Black History Month or the end of term, where the curriculum, the formal curriculum, has more or less come to an end, and the kids are still there. So how can we occupy them? And this is a point in which culture comes in, and the dissatisfaction for that with that for me as a creative or an academic is that you never feel that it's integral to the curriculum. It's always kind of co-opted in. And say, for example, you're doing storytelling and it's, drawing in African Americans or African tales. What you're trying to do, expose young people to a whole universe that's unlocked in that story. And in a sense, actually, it's almost counterproductive to just come in for an afternoon, because what you're doing is reinforcing that actually this is about Black people are entertaining or can provide entertainment. I think there has been a growing criticism, which is slightly ironic, given that it's actually Black actors in Britain who took on board and were inspired by African America's Black History Month. But there's been a kind of a pushback by today's Black activists. And I think that has impacted on schools and so on, around trying to move away from the sort of Black history model, how to think about having much more sustained Black presence or Black storytelling. I think the challenge I have experientially is that because there isn't yet a fixed narrative about what works, what doesn't, that sometimes it can be quiet. It can reinforce, I think, those negative messagings around being Black for Black students. So ironically, I've found that white students have sometimes been more receptive, because in a sense, they think you're going to come in and talk about slavery. And this is the thing where the schools have yet to find, how do you talk about Blackness beyond the intersection with whiteness, but beyond also the intersection of slavery. But as someone who is deeply concerned with slavery, neither do I'd feel uncomfortable if, and as sometimes is the case, that Black history becomes a sort of a chest beating story of Black excellence, with only C.J. Walker's being included. So I don't think yet we've arrived at a place of knowing what that looks like. And within Rob's mention, what it looks like to have a healthy inclusion of Black History Month. But on the other hand, we are in an educationally hostile environment where I think for the last 13 years, our government has not really been fond of finding space for diverse stories. So schools are trying their best and so on and so on. But it's not really.
It's like California with a Nigeria in the face.
Yeah. So, and then to add to that, schools have so much less budget. So I would say that 10 years ago, I would probably spend at least, I would say that almost a third of my income stream would be visiting schools, either as a performer or speaking. And now I can count the amount of times that I go into a school in a year as a speaker. It feels as if that the reality is that the way that we've structured education, it actually leaves quite little for additional input, which is where I think trying to create integrated approaches for Black stories, Black history is so important. But again, we have a number of people who are trying to work with that existing curriculum, but it is quite rigid. So you actually feel that, you need the state, and in us, it's just the one state, to be supportive, and otherwise we're just playing around the edges.
Okay.
And the reason why that matters is, going back to your first question, growing up in a working class global majority and white working class area, I had no idea why we were at the poor end of town. What was that deprivation about? Um, what were the status games and the negative things that both black kids and Asian kids said about each other? All the epithets that you hear on TV as derogatory are the ones that, like in TV, we see African Americans refer to each other as the N-word. We had our versions and, but I didn't know why. I had no understanding of sociology or history and so on. And it wasn't until, and so it was, it was a real battle to have that sort of resilience and sense that this is not something innate. But it wasn't until really that I came to university that I had an alternative narrative for the social structures that I lived and grew up with and how they create certain systems of living today and sustain them. And so I think if your society is not supportive of alternative ways of talking about structural racism and so on, structural inequality, then what are you left with but the idea that somehow you guys haven't, your parents haven't tried hard enough. This is the system and it's laissez-faire and you've just got to try and make it. You don't really have a kind of way of countering that as a person of color, as a working class person, as a black person.
No, absolutely. Yeah. I was talking to my students the other day about the idea. So when I was younger, the idea of culture of poverty. And so the reason that, African Americans and minorities didn't succeed was because of their culture of poverty, ignoring the structural inequalities, ignoring the centuries of not being able to accumulate wealth when other people were able to do so. So absolutely. So that's one of the reasons I did the course is because I definitely saw those parallels. There's a lot of like what you were just talking about. I see many similar parallels kind of with American education and the kind of idea of, we don't want to ignore slavery, but we want to say there's more than slavery. But as you kind of mentioned, the chest beating, we don't want it to be just all celebration, just kind of almost like integrating and normalizing our history within the larger scope, and as well as other histories of other groups as well. So yeah, I definitely see a similar kind of struggle here as well.
Yeah.
So I did want to circle. Oh, you go ahead.
No, I was going to say that I think Rob alluded to it. That there's a growing body of literature on Black Britain, but we have been quite reliant on UK stories. I mean, we haven't even looked at Arab
US.
and Latin, sorry,
You
US
mean
stories,
US?
US stories, yeah. We haven't even thought about the Latin American Latinx stories yet. But yeah, there's a growing interest. People like David Olusogun, Peter Fryer, Stephen Bourne. But yeah, I think to coin a phrase by Paul Gilroy, the Black Atlantic, much of our understanding of history actually looks out and in. Increasingly, there's more research that's being done in Black Britain that out and in is getting richer. Whereas I think for much of us growing up, we looked out, we looked out. But I think there was a time when after a while, growing up in the 80s, there's only so much Lionel Richie mansions that you can cope with before you start thinking like, I don't know anybody this rich.
Yeah, and I didn't either.
Yeah.
It's interesting actually that in Bristol, one of the key people who unearthed took upon transatlantic slavery in Bristol as their key researcher was Dr. Madge Dresser, Jewish American woman who came with a particular political sensibility, kind of leftist leaning political sensibility, which also is, I think, a lot of the people, quote unquote, white, racialized as white people who, we don't say that, but it's true too, people who were here, who started looking at this story and kept this story alive, were the leftist sensibilities, really. People who were not as interested in, well, they'll be despise the racism, but they were more interested in unpicking the structural classism underpinning these things. And they'd also recognize that the racism, and they could be quite right in this recognition, was something that was constructed in order to justify slavery, as opposed to some people thinking, no, I'm Black and I'll always be ontologically seen as inferior to some people. And the idea of African prince, anyway, But the other thing is that the leftist side will probably do is try to say that by going too much on the race side, then you ignore the class side, for example. The problem is there's so many potential binaries here. So Edson mentioned Arab, for example. So if we started talking about Arab enslavement of sub-Saharan Africans or up to this day or whatever's going on, then or Mamluks. I mean, Mamluks were white slaves, weren't they? Which were or not necessarily just always white, but people non-native enslaved people who could take on positions of military power and stuff like that. But we start getting into this place where it's like, oh yeah, but this was worse. Oh yeah, but that was, what about the Holocaust? We start getting into these reactive places, and we definitely haven't got to a place yet of maturity around this conversation. Like if we talk about the Second World War now, for example, we know there's one big bad guy in the center of it, Hitler, and there's other varying degrees of bad guys. But there's still enough diversity of storytelling and narrative and understanding around the whole thing for us to not be so caught up with very limited ideas about what it was, what it's about. You know what I mean? I think we're still there a little bit with the whole slavery thing, considering that we're talking about over 500 years of history.
Yeah, it's a lot.
And I think back to your question about passion for education, I guess it's like, I mean, Edson's more of a formal storyteller, but I guess I'm a storyteller because I'm a media producer. But there are definitely I'm looking at this book actually down here, which is the book that Edson and Madge and anyway, all right, it's not coming out. Maybe you can do a little slide or something.
Yeah, I have. I can do that. I have a copy here. It's right. Yeah, it's right.
Okay, yeah, good. I mean, definitely one of the things we were trying to do with that was to mature the conversation, to make it less about, and people so really drunk this book. Yeah, that's the one. Oh yeah, nice. People really drunk up the book because it was meant as a piece of community education. And one of the things I think the passion about education is when you start digging into this story, because there's so much to it, there's a tendency to want to say, oh, and another thing. Oh, and another thing. And did you know this? And partly the provocateur in us, the educator, the provocateur in us, someone has assumptions, you want to say, oh yeah, but what about that? Oh yeah, but what about that? And I think that's energy still, excuse me, that energy is still there, largely, so that maintains the passion to want to share this story and develop the story and find out more about the story, I guess, or these stories, I should say. But certainly being in the city of Bristol, which had such a key role as a city in this history, it's a good opportunity, I think, for us to actually use the city as a piece of learning in itself, looking around the city and seeing how it connects to the story. Obviously, the whole Colston statue thing put the story at the center. And I think that the city as itself, the city as a whole, has I think the city's matured as a whole in terms of its broadest understanding of these things. They're not as reactive. For example, when I came here to Bristol in 89 or so, you could go into the library, I'm not quoting anyone in particular, and get people say, oh yeah, that didn't happen. You could get people in the civic services who would be completely ignorant about the basic connectivities of these things. That is definitely not the case anymore. Absolutely not the case anymore. City archives, city libraries, you couldn't get that degree of ignorance, which is what it was really. And denial, which comes from a sense of defensiveness, because it's like that one of the best discussions ever for me in the city around that was, should Bristol apologize for the slave trade? And I thought that was really insightful and enlightening. It's online somewhere. I have to send a link somewhere. Held at the Empire and Commonwealth Museum, which name's questionable in the first place. But there was a Toye Nagbetu, a guy called Toye, an Afrocentric guy, made a big difference, I think, to the spice of the event. If not, it'd been quite dull. But the proposal and it was like it was a citywide conversation. The BBC were running it in the daytime. They had their own little poll. The Evening Post had their own poll, different results. But what was fascinating, throughout the whole discussion, people, well attended, people were airing their views. And I think prior to that, if someone had said to me, oh, we shouldn't apologize, my reactiveness, oh, yeah, you're being racist or you're ignorant or you're that, but actually it's much more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
The in the end, there was a debate that the chairperson was gonna scrap the vote, thinking that it was too contentious to vote on. But then someone from the floor said, no, let's have this vote. So they started to vote. And in the room, you could see the hands, should Bristol apologize for the slave trade? No, it was going to be a no. The hand in the rooms were going up for a no. But a voice, or the voice, another voice, or whatever, called for a change of question. And they went from, should Bristol apologize to the slave trade, to should Bristol institutions apologize for the slave trade?
Okay.
And sorry. And then the same room voted completely the other way. And to me, that was a really powerful insight into how we see each other in the city about this stuff.
Okay, okay. Yeah, I'm looking at my time here, so I want to make sure there's a couple, just a couple questions I wanted to get to before you guys have to go. Um, and it had to do with the Colston statue. That's one of the big things that I learned when I was in Bristol was about the legacy of Edward Colston. So I don't go into all kind of details there. Any students who want to learn about that, please sign up for the course. Would definitely, definitely be an opportunity to kind of learn about that. But I wanted to kind of talk about whether or not you believe that, well, two things. One is, do you think the statue would have come down if not for the murder of George Floyd? So, murder of George Floyd was in May of 2020. The statue came down in June. So, do you think that was that kind of the main thing that allowed that to happen, or was there kind of already kind of a direction it was going to where that statue was coming down? And my second question, kind of piggyback on that, is what do you think is the kind of legacy, the after effects of that statue? Like, did it actually make any difference to come down, having been taken down like that, or do you think that was kind of like didn't really have any real impact? So, kind of, what's your take on that? So,
Um, I would say the statue would have come down but not necessarily literally.
okay,
So I think the Black Lives Matter march, it was one of the biggest marches outside London, if not the biggest march outside London. That provided, I think, the kind of the cover and the energy for the literal taking down of the statue as a kind of an insurrectionary act. I think to have been able to do that,
And I would say yes, directly felt with George Floyd. Sorry, go on.
sorry. So I would say that,
Yeah.
So I think if it hadn't been for the Black Lives Matter moment, the George Floyd's murder, which it was a response to, of course, I don't think it would have happened at that time. The challenge was you had the conversation was held between cadres of activists and liberal academics, but it wasn't one in which I'd say the whole city was participant. There's been more and more of a conversation that had engaged more and more people in Bristol, but nonetheless, what we were talking about was how to manage the narrative, whether to put a plaque and so on, and things had been scuppered, and there'd been some activists who had guerrilla art-wise had made it very clear what Colston was about. But I think the focus on Colston, which pulled in so many, thousands of Bristolians, happened, I think, much more recently. And then with the march, it became a focus point of people saying no to, I think, a legacy. I think they were saying no to a particular history of Bristol, a particular identification. And Colston then was a kind of seen as the site of that identification. Because at the end of the day, that march was, I would say, 60, if not 70% white.
okay.
And most of those people were affirming their solidarity. And in that affirming of solidarity, Colston was something which they wanted to rupture from powerfully. Which put those people who turned up at variance with other parts of the city, who had grown up with the 19th century story of Colston, with his name being given to all these philanthropic causes. I would say post the legacy, it's interesting to see I think we're still trying to make sense of how it's impacted. It certainly changed the conversation in Bristol, I think, is what Rob was saying. It's certainly become a priority, and race in Bristol and the legacy of the slavery are much higher up the profile ladder, even more so than it was before. And it was a growing discussion. It didn't create the conversation. The conversation had been building and building and building, and the statue came down. And ironically, organizations that were in the process of changing their name suddenly looked as if they were being reactive to the statue came down. And it's like, no, we were doing this anyway. It's basically a bunch of new actors came into the came into the scene and was like guns blazing, and it looked as if they'd started it. But I think the challenge is trying to, I think with any civil rights movement and moment, is to unpick who are the beneficiaries. There's some organizations wanting to diversify, wanting to create schemes. I would say the challenge is that in this sense of white organizations and individuals trying to stress their breakage from a particular past, that the danger is that they don't realize this is gradualist and structural work, and that what you have is reactive work, which often then benefits those who are already well placed. How does it enfranchise? How does it really reach the interests of African, Caribbean, Black communities, global majority communities, for whom the structural issues are still there? And I think sometimes one of the journeys is for people to understand what Black communities, global majority communities actually want and need. For example, there are people who said, look, for us, it's about knife crime in the city. For us, it's about educational underachievement. You guys think it's about pulling down a statue. What has that got to do? It's not. So the Black response has been complex to the statue coming down, because it doesn't entirely meet all the needs that a community feels. And some of those needs are about the narrative of the city, and has opened a door to reparations conversations. But equally, I know of people, and I'm part of conversations where people have felt that it's an irrelevance, and others have felt the statue should have stayed up because they wanted the evidence of the crime.
Okay. Rob?
I'd say absolutely definite response to George Floyd. Yes, it's a white response, and I don't think that can be taken away. People say if they were Black, nonsense. They weren't, and that's important. Let's observe the situation as it is. I wasn't at the pulling down. Edson was at the ground zero and pulling down, but I sat through the trial. In whenever it was 21 into 22, and it was basically trying to communicate. And obviously, lawyers know what they're doing. They know what they're telling. They need to convince a jury of something. It was a pretty much all right jury, probably one brown face. I couldn't see them from the public gallery. You couldn't see the jury, but there's probably one not white face on the jury. There was also one completely intransigent voice when the judge was looking for a majority and the unanimous verdict. There was the jury, the chair of the jury came back and said, we're 11-1, and it doesn't look like we're going to change that one opinion. So as much as there's no point us going back, really. So he took the majority verdict. 11-1 is pretty strong. But all of the trial was trying to construct the Black experience for white people. To say, I say, beg your pardon, the white people in the jury, that didn't need constructing for the white people in the dock, because they knew why they took it down. So, and the key insight for the city throughout all this was the survey that revealed, the city ran a survey, should it have been pulled down, what should we do with it, blah, 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 blah. And basically the dichotomy was generational, age. Older people thought one thing, as Edson said, they grew up with narrative, and younger people thought another thing. Although I don't think some of the older people necessarily was thinking about the narrative they grew up with. I think they were thinking, how dare they? That's not the way to do things. I think that's what. But this is a bit kind of Fanon, Sartre, need a bit of violence in there. Thankfully, it was just violence to a piece of metal. And
Mhm.
interestingly, the police knew this as well. The police commander on the day knew this, and I think that was really important to understand some of what came out there. But yeah, definitely a response. Definitely like Edson said, it accelerated certain conversations in the city, and it shifted where they were, but they were absolutely happening. It definitely sparked other conversations around the world, I think, as well.
Mhm.
And I think the thing to remember as well, the thing we probably still stuck on, is that Colston is only one small name amongst
Yeah.
all of it. And Edson's quite right. There's a kind of a complex Black response, which is more about the realities rather than the superficialities. And while it might be, and also we don't, I mean, the other day, the University of Bristol had a question about whether they should rename certain buildings. Now, their faculty, student, and staff are really keen on this renaming. The university put it out to Black communities in Bristol, and Black communities come back saying, "Forget the renaming. We don't like. We don't want to hide evidence. Let's keep the names. Do you know what I mean? And let's do this instead. Let's make these structural changes instead, or these project changes instead." And the university kept the names. They made some changes, but they actually kept the names because actually it would you cannot where are you going to stop there are so many names that you
Yeah.
could connect to this. It's just not worth it in many ways. So Colston becomes the Hitler figure, the kind of pantomime villain figure, but he's by no means the only figure in any of this story. So I think once again, symbolically, it was a really important move. The other thing, by the way, shouldn't be forgotten, it was also a response to lockdown because
Yeah.
everybody was Black for a minute. Everybody knew what it was like to walk on the street and get arrested, potentially get arrested just for walking on the street. Just for, hang on, I'm just walking on the street. Yeah, but you are against the law. Freedom is against the law. You know, you can't move. It's like slave Negro codes. You know, freedom of assembly, no. Freedom of movement, no. You know what I mean? So I think part of it also was people responding to lockdown itself and feeling a certain empathy for a minute going on there. So yeah, that would be my take on all of that.
Okay. Okay. So I think that's all the time. Dr. Burton, I know you have to go. I know you have to teach.
Yeah, thank you. I
Oh.
mean, I would say that just to add to Rob's thing, I didn't really mind everybody being observing lockdown, but the only thing I would say is that we were in the global moments. I think what happened by the world being silent, you were able to focus on one thing, one moment, one time. So I think that was unique in yes, that made the focus and interest in Colston also unique time, because otherwise I think it would have been crowded out by, the news
Other,
cycle, which
yeah.
changes every 5 seconds.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate this. I definitely think we should do this again. There are two pretty big elections coming up. I know in Britain as well as the US. So I definitely want to have a conversation because
Yeah.
there's a lot that I'm still learning about the British like political system, and I know from the outside looking at ours is an absolute madhouse. So like what was happening here. I'm still trying to
Yeah.
figure that out myself. So, but yes, I definitely want to talk about those at some point. And I also have a conversation because one of my questions, I know we don't have time today, but I did want to talk about the challenges facing the Black community in Britain. Going forward as Britain becomes more diverse, and also in the post-Brexit era and that type of situation. But we can actually put a pin in that and talk about it at a different time. But again, thank you so much. I really appreciate everything, your time and everything. So, and again, my apologies for the tech issues. It'll be hopefully next time I can figure it all out and get it working a little bit better. So,
It's
all
been
right.
Thank you.
lovely.
Good to
Thank
see
you.
All right, yeah, same here. Thank you so much.
you.
All right, cheers.
All right. Bye-bye.
Now, if you found that video interesting and or informative, please like this video and subscribe to my channel. Also, please share this video. And if you have any questions about Bristol, England, the Black Lives Matter movement in England, or Edward Colston, please leave those questions in the comment section below. Thank you all for your time and have a wonderful rest of your day.